Welcome everybody to another edition of the Art Business Podcast. My name's David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director at the Sotheby's Institute of Art in London, where I direct the MA in Art Business. My students are actually next Friday about to go out to the European Fine Art Fair, followed by Rijksmuseum, Stedelijk, Street Art Museum, etc. in Amsterdam. So they have a good time there. So my guest today is Rachel Cole, and Rachel Cole has just started an art advisory service that we'll speak about later called Romulus. I'll put the links in the podcast for you. And her background is she studied for a bachelor's in the history of art and psychology at the University of Michigan, and then decided to study a master's degree in the history of art at Hunter College. And I think another highlight in her, well, then she moved into working in the art world and had various jobs working in galleries, I think auction houses and art businesses. And last year she won she's one of the winners of the 30 under 30 Forbes Art and Style group for 2022. So congratulations on that, Rachel, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
And I'd better say now that Rachel is currently in Dubai. Hence, I'm recording this podcast earlier in the morning from the UK, and I think it's the early afternoon in Dubai.
Yes.
And she's there, of course, because of the art fair, which I believe finished yesterday. So we might speak about your experience at the art fair later in the podcast. But to start with, as ever, what's your favorite city, Rachel, and why?
This was a tough one to choose. I would say Paris, of course. It's many people's favorite city. I think for me, I studied abroad there, actually, in my undergrad studies. And it was the first time I'd seen the art I studied in real life. And I'm talking these massive paintings by Jacques-Louis David, even the other massive paintings by Courbet. And it was just really interesting to see these works come to life. And I was 21 years old in this city running around with my friends. So every time I visit, which luckily is a couple times a year for work, I'm reminded of just how magical of a place it really is without sounding super cheesy. But I would have to say that is my favorite city.
Well, I think, yeah. Actually, it's some time since I've been to Paris. It's pre-pandemic I was in Paris. Just to say a little bit about that we used to regularly take our art business students to Paris for FIAC, the former Contemporary Art Fair, which, as you know, has recently sort of transmogrified into something else. We didn't stop going because we didn't like going. We stopped going because there was some visa issue. It was very early on in the academic year. We have a big international group of students. Some of the students couldn't get their Schengen visas into Europe in time, which just shows how these bureaucratical things can get in the way of, good things. So that's a shame. But have you been to the Bourse in Paris yet?
Which is
the Pinot.
Oh
yeah. No, that's one that I'm really looking forward to going to.
It's fantastic.
And I guess the other thing about Paris at the moment, of course, is that we in our curriculum we speak quite a lot. In fact, we actually had a whole seminar a couple of weeks ago about what are the threats of Paris to London in terms of the international art market, and that debate continues, of course. I think most recently there was this scare for the Parisian art market because their government is threatening to put the VAT up to 20% or something, which would obviously be in favour of the UK. But I think it's a wait and see. But I hope that we continue to have very good relations with the art world in Paris, because it's such a wonderful art centre, as you know. Do you have a favourite, maybe excluding the obvious Louvre and Pompidou Centre? Do you have any other favourite sort of art locations that you can think of?
Oh, yes. I love the Musée d'Orsay. I don't speak French, so I butcher every pronunciation.
I should have put that one in there as well, shouldn't I? That's the big three.
When I lived abroad, I lived very close to the Pompidou. I think I was so entrenched in the like art history part of it. I didn't really understand contemporary art probably, or appreciate it as much as I should have. But the Musée d'Orsay with the old train station and sort of its development during the World's Fair. I mean, there were so many things about it. The collection is also so magical. And when I was last there was a massive Kehinde Wiley painting, sculpture. I mean, just putting those words in dialogue with the permanent collection was unbelievable.
And of course, the commercial galleries in Paris for both, French old furniture right through to contemporary. Amazing place to visit, as is London and New York, for the commercial galleries.
London. London was a close second for me, by the way, in terms of favorite city. I do have to say, I love London. I love the art scene there. I love that it's a little bit more centralized, and I am curious to see what ends up happening with the Paris versus London in terms of like the Western art market. But as you said, we'll just have to wait and see.
Absolutely interesting. Always interesting going on every day in the art world. So moving, if you had to choose like a non-urban location that you love, it could be, by the ocean or in the middle of the countryside. Do you have any places like that?
I do. One place in particular called Stourhead. It's in Wiltshire. It's about 2 hours southwest of London. Have you been? I see you smiling.
Yes, absolutely.
You've been?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the now let's get this right. I think it's a National Trust property, and it's very much based on a lake with hilly woods around it with like classical follies.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly what it is. It's incredible. I've been twice. So during 2 different seasons, 2 different years. It's my favorite place probably ever. And I'm actually, I know we'll get to this, but I'm actually writing my thesis on it.
Wow.
On that place. So I've studied it.
Can't wait to get to that. Because I think I know the way you might be studying it, but I'm not going to preempt that discussion. So let's wait and see.
All right. I can't wait.
The other thing about Stourhead, and one of the reasons I've been to it a couple of times recently, is because of Hauser and Wirth is nearby. So there's Hauser and Wirth, the commercial contemporary gallery that has its famous rustic location near Stourhead, in Somerset and at Bruton. So it's literally 20 minutes drive from there. So whenever I go to Hauser and Wirth, I usually pop over to Stourhead. So you're getting the contemporary with the classic at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. The first time I actually went to Stourhead, I made the mistake of going only for a few hours. I didn't realize exactly how big it was. So I had gone to the Hauser and Wirth breakfast during Freeze at Somerset, took a taxi to Stourhead, and then had a train a few hours later, and I just was overwhelmed, obviously. But that is always a very good combination. Is the all of the Hauser and Wirth properties are incredible, but Somerset is particularly nice.
And so is the Roth Bar and Grill where you had your breakfast.
Oh yeah,
at Hauser and Wirth. It's a cool place. One of my alumni, actually, I haven't done a podcast with her yet, Dea Vanagan. She's on maternity leave at the moment, I think, but she became their sales director. So hence the links with, we take the students there quite regularly. It's a difficult place to get to, though, with a lot of people. It's okay, if you're on your own in a car or on a train. It's quite difficult with a big group in a coach. But in a lovely part of the side. So it also reminds us that there are places outside of the city where the art world is actually very, very dynamic. You've got Stourhead as a kind of classic heritage property, and then you've got Hauser and Wirth as an international sort of, modern contemporary, art centre.
Absolutely. And in terms of difficult to get to, I also have been fortunate enough to visit their property in Menorca, which is actually on an island within the island of Menorca. And it is planes, trains, and automobiles. It is difficult to get to, but well worth the visit.
Lucky you. I think the first gallery I went to, commercial gallery that is now very, very well known, wasn't quite so well known at the time, was Limoncello in San Gimignano in Italy, which Yeah, which is kind of like, it's in a tiny little piazza right outside the main center at San Gimignano. So anyway, do you have a favorite building, Rachel?
Well, I love all the buildings on Stourhead's property, if that counts, especially the Temple of Apollo. But favorite buildings otherwise, I love buildings from antiquity, a little bit more contemporary buildings. I love these sort of homes or estates that have been transformed into housing artwork, whether that be Somerset House holding the 154 Fair, the Walls collection. Love those sort of snapshots into the past within the homes. But here in Dubai, I'm really loving the Burj Khalifa. It is pretty spectacular.
I've just made a big mistake there. It's not Limoncello, it's Continua, the gallery in San Gim.
Oh, okay.
I was
There's a
just kind of,
continua here too, I think.
yeah. It's expanded.
In the Burj,
I
the
thought
other
I'm
Burj.
wrong. I was thinking Italy and Limoncello, which is of course Sorrento, where it started, the
little
liqueur.
Freudian.
So I'm just unashamedly saying apologies for that. A correction, of course, I mean Continua Gallery in San Gim, which when I went, it was just a tiny little gallery. I'm probably talking early. I don't want to make another mistake. I'm probably talking sort of like very early millennium, and then it started appearing at big art fairs, and had a great brand, and now has centres across the world. But I'm very jealous that you've been to the Menorca Hauserwerth.
I mean, the show was one of my favorite artists, Rashid Johnson. So all of it was just spectacular, start to finish. And it was a beautiful, intimate dinner. If you just happen to be in, I guess, Spain, or I mean, highly recommend.
Yeah. And so, are you into any music? Eclectic?
Yeah. I love music.
Yeah.
I love all kinds of music. I'm not, particular to one genre or another. I think that throughout my life, I've sort of been attached to one, during a specific period of time, whether that's like rap or hip hop or rock and roll or classical music. But when I'm studying or working, classical, of course, always. And I've gotten really just hoping to learn more about that too, obviously.
I think it's very interesting, Rachel, because I think you're probably the first person that has talked more about, particularly as one of the younger guests that are talking not just about hip hop, etc., pop music, but also about classical. We don't often get that, so that's quite interesting. Sometimes I worry that people aren't being exposed to the classical music as much as they used to be. But there you go. And I guess that conforms with your architectural artistic tastes with Stourhead and so on, which is like obviously 18th century sort of neoclassicism, Palladianism and so on.
Exactly, 100%. It definitely relates to that. I think, again, just the sort of snapshot in time. And I love it because it has its own history. And the woman I'm actually traveling with here, she works in music. So we talk a lot about music history and how there is that correlation between art movements and music movements almost exactly within time, starting in I think it's the High Renaissance. But either way, I love classical music. I mean, Amadeus is one of my favorite movies of all time. So I know that cannot be my like sole form of education and understanding, but I'm excited to learn more.
I was over the weekend, I downloaded this recent movie Tar. I don't know if you've heard about that, with Cate Blanchett. She won a award.
Yeah, I have.
But I'm just bringing that into the discussion because that for listeners as well, I think it's quite controversial. But basically, in a nutshell, it's about a woman conductor called Tar, played by Cate Blanchett fantastically. It's quite an intellectual film. She does a lot of talking about music and the political status, as it were, of the conductor. Are they dictatorial or are they democratic? And that leads into lots of other sub themes in the film. And she's at the end of recording a Mahler symphony series. So Mahler is one of my favorite composers, and the last one she's about to record. The pandemic interrupted, is the Fifth Symphony, and she's in Berlin. and that's another great center of musical activity and a musical tradition, of course, the Berlin Philharmonic. So no, I just wondered whether you'd seen that. It's because it's a very, very interesting film, I think, about women, in a traditional male role as a conductor, often with very, very, mainly men in the orchestra, and it plays on all sorts of very, very interesting, tensions. But it's also a great film if you're into classical music. I guess that was my main point.
Amazing. I mean, I'm so behind on so many things I have to watch apparently, but that's just moved its way up the list. I'll tell you that.
And then I guess from music, we've got obviously the last question here is about arts, whether you have any early memories of art as something different from, other things, and how you got into art.
How I got into art. I actually didn't really grow up. I grew up around art. Like I had, a little bit of art in my home. My parents weren't collectors. They just bought what they liked. And I didn't really go to museums growing up. I really wasn't, that much of an academic at all growing up. And so I think my first memories of art was art in my home, and how I got into it was in college. I was minoring in Spanish, was majoring in psychology, as I mentioned, and I thought I wanted to maybe minor in film because I really love film as well. The class wasn't for me. I ended up going to the classroom across the hallway, sat down, and it was 19th century French painting class, and it changed everything for me. But early memories of art, I mean, I think my parents are also both artists. It was something that was, or my father's a musician, my mother's a painter, all hobby when I was growing up, but it was always just something special. But if you had told me, 20 years ago that I would be an art advisor working in the art world, I would be shocked to hear that.
Yeah, same here. Exactly the same story. I mean, I started as a kid. It was Latin at school, leading to an interest in Roman, and then wider classical culture, and then eventually doing a PhD that took me to Pompeii to study there. Absolute love of that culture, and then and then getting into teaching classical studies, and then moving to Sotheby's Institute of Art, teaching classics and classical art there. Suddenly one day, my director coming in saying, we got a problem. Our director of the MA and art business is leaving at Christmas. Can you take over just temporarily? And I got into that and stuck my heels in. It was just so exciting. And this is the world that you're now living in, Rachel. And it's but we're not unusual. Lots of people I speak to in the art world have similar stories, which is nice, I think.
It is nice. It's like I can't remember a period of time without art because it's so all-consuming now, and every single thing I do, from work, from building my new company to opening my Instagram to reading to watching things, art is so entrenched in my life. I can't remember a time without it. But then I know for a very, very, very long time there was no part of the art was not even a discussion. Actually, one more early memory I have, because this is a great story. I was in high school visiting Spain with my father and my best friend at the time, who was living there. And we were teenagers, so we slept in and, didn't care. My father woke up early, went to the Picasso Museum, and he's a musician. And he said that it was the most inspiring moment of his adult life. Essentially, it was going into that museum, seeing that level of mastery. Obviously, if you're looking at Picasso, you're looking at, such a range of work and interpretation and development within one single being. And he took that and ran with it. And I remember, obviously I'd never made it to the museum. Obviously I didn't care about art at the time, but hearing that, I was like, this is something interesting. I thought art was just art. I didn't understand how much it could affect other areas of life, really.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. I'm just thinking of an equivalent. It just rings a bell in my head when I was little. My parents took me to Spain for a beach holiday. That's what everyone was doing in those days. And there was a little coach tour to go to a bullfight, of all things. I was about a 12-year-old boy, and I was kind of quite curiously fascinated by this thing, this bullfight, you know. And I thought that's be something to tell my friends when I get home. But it was in this little town called Figueras, which might ring a bell. This is where I think Dali's home was there, and there's a Dali museum. And I remember that we went in there, and for some, you know, we went to the really weird thing. We went to the Dali museum before the bullfight. And so I remember that was so strange, because like when I was a kid, there was no social media. There were, you know, it was just books, and you just, you know, I didn't live in central London, so it would be difficult to see someone like Dali in real life, basically, is what I'm saying, you know. Not much exposure in galleries at that time. We didn't really go to galleries, to be honest. That came later for me. But I do remember going and seeing these Salvador Dalis and being, you know, that etched in my memory, this kind of weird sort of stuff that, it's kind of affected my understanding of my definition of what art is, I guess. I thought, is this art, is it? And of course, surrealism is coming up big in the art market again at the moment. So last year, I think it doubled the auction sales in surrealism, according to some recent reports. So that's something to watch out for. This kind of, I think a lot of the interest is coming from new buyers, like Asian buyers and millennials and Gen Z. I can see why they might get into that, because if you think of digital media, you can see how that is so easily manipulated into something surreal, I guess.
That's very interesting. I
Yeah.
love drawing those comparisons.
Yeah.
You know, for example, I think at least what I'm placing in terms of more emerging mid-career, younger artists that are producing work post-pandemic, I guess we can safely say post-pandemic. I see the work as being almost entirely now abstract, and that's what people are looking for, and that's what they're craving, and that's what's being produced. And, you know, it does remind me of sort of going back towards, you know, post-war art, where there was a lot of death during the pandemic. There was a lot of racial injustice. There was a lot that was brought to light, and a lot of hatred developed, whatever you want to say it was. And I think that the thought of painting bodies once again, like it was after World War II, is just not of interest. And I think it's sort of like we need to dive deeper, paint the subconscious, and not focus on human beings for a little bit.
Interesting. And that sounds as though it's coming out of your interest in psychology, the way you kind of read all that stuff.
I can't help it. It comes out.
Mind you, I noticed that I was following a sale the other day. Was it Christie's contemporary sale in London? And there was a Marlene Dumas painting of a body bag. And I thought, is that going to sell? And it did quite well, you know, reasonably well. So, you know, this thing about bodies, I guess it works both ways, really. Maybe it can be seen as quite cathartic after something like the pandemic, to have art about death as well, and more figurative art. Who knows? The lovely thing about the art world, Rachel, as you know, is that these things play against one another. So you get these oppositional forces at work. So you will get surrealism coming back in for the reasons that you're saying, but you might also get a fascination in the body coming back in. Who knows?
It's like the Jericho, where he would paint like the morgue body parts to prepare for Raft of Medusa. Very grim. I like it.
There's a whole tradition of that, isn't there? But right back to Leonardo, and probably in the classical world, you could probably find an example. So educational subjects. I didn't realize you'd majored in psychology, but what made you maybe take the art history as a minor and then decide to jump across psychology into art for masters?
Yeah, so I was entirely psychology and Spanish. Art history wasn't even a thought.
I thought you'd done art history as BA.
Oh no. So when I decided art history, I'd taken that first class, which was incredible. It was with Professor Lay, and I thought I'm going full force. I'm going to double major. And I remember I was deciding where to study abroad. I decided on Paris, and, you know, really dedicated my time to filling all those credits, because I had already essentially completed a degree in psychology and a minor in Spanish. So now I just really had to put all my effort junior and senior year into art history, which was incredible. But what made me decide to go full force? I did research in psychology in New York, where it was a very intense sort of door-to-door interview, recruitment, looking at previously incarcerated adults and the stress levels of their children. So this was very dark, and it was difficult because for various reasons, sort of bureaucratic red tape, whatever, we couldn't actually help anyone. We were just collecting information and saliva samples to prove a point that we all knew, which was, yes, of course, these children have higher, cortisol levels because they're watching their parents get arrested. So it was very discouraging to not be able to do anything from that, to be able to talk to young children that have drug problems, suicidal ideation, whatever it might be. And then we hand them a hotline number. So that was very difficult for me. And I also think that weirdly enough translates into why I started advising, because I think me working within a bigger institution is just not really my thing. As much as I would have liked it to be, I think that if I see something and there can be something done about it, I really like to go full steam ahead and work to make a change, which is what I'm doing with my company, which is what I do with advising every day. But back to how did my interests in art develop with that? I just use psychology as something entirely separate from art history. I knew that if art history didn't pan out, and I'll be honest, I didn't know any options of careers in art, like history, after having an art history degree, not being an artist whatsoever. I thought, okay, auction house, okay, museum, okay. No one really told us what our options were. We just had these emails about internships that we knew were very prestigious that we should apply to. So my psychology degree was in both clinical and developmental psychology, which meant that I could do research, I could pursue a higher education, do counseling, whatever it might be. And then art history was just completely separate. But as we sort of talked about, they definitely converge at various points, whether it's understanding the psychology of the artist, of the collector, of the institutions I'm working with, whatever it might be. Having that background has helped me tremendously.
Yes, and I think you were going to speak about your dissertation on Stourhead.
Sorry?
You were going to speak about your dissertation on the research on Stourhead.
Oh, yes, back to Stourhead. So that's for my master's.
This was your master's dissertation, yeah.
So I'm only halfway finished. I will finish it one day. But undergrad was 19th century, and then master's is 18th century. So I wanted to go back further in time. And I wanted to understand, how did we get to Manet? How did we get to Impressionism? How did we get there? So 18th century, I look at Stourhead specifically because I love the way in which that particular place is sort of the convergence between various subjects within the 18th century. So whether that's neoclassicism to Rococo, imperialism, colonialism, landscape sort of genres or concepts, and the writings of Edmund Burke and William Gilpin, the influence of antiquity, of course, and empire, these excavations at Pompeii. I know you obviously know a ton about these. I'm trying to think what else, but I'm using this essentially as a guide to go through many of those topics, because the owners and developers of the property throughout the mid to late 18th century, various bits of those subjects are very much a prominent point within its development. So the paper is about Stourhead, but it's not doing what previous academics have done, which is compare the landscape to a Claude Lorraine painting or whatever. It's these sort of academics arguing with each other about interpretation. What I'm doing instead is placing it within its context in order to teach people about this century, why it's so important, how it defines a lot of art collecting, production, everything along those lines today. And a lot of what I want to do is teach. And I think that this is a good way to start because it's something that people can digest. It's it's a place.
Yeah, maybe we could just unpack that a little bit further. I guess, may I ask you, just for the reader's sake, just very briefly to describe, because I think it's really, really unusual, a place like this. If anyone who's never been to like an 18th century is much more about the garden for a start than the house. A lot of these places, although they are connected. I was walking through Chiswick Gardens and Burlington House yesterday, which is a similar period and has similar ideas between the classical building and the classicism, which is extended into the garden, and eventually becomes wilderness, deliberate wilderness. So there's this beautiful sort of structuralist way of looking at this, where we're looking at binary oppositions between culture and nature, and the way the garden becomes like a limen, a threshold between total wildness and irrationality, and the house, which is the opposite, which is where you're cultured and rational, etc. But could you describe for the listeners, maybe subjectively in your words, when you get to Stourhead and you walk around, what do you see? Just give us a little kind of tour so that we can imagine this place.
Wow. I mean, yes, it is. So the last time I was there was in October. So keep in mind, it's entering into autumn, or very much in autumn, actually. So when you get there, it is like a maze. And what we talk about, this sort of unkept landscape that is actually obviously very well thought of, to the point where each hill was created. It was completely rendered and thought out in an artificial way. But when you get there, I mean, it's massive. It is like so big. The paths to get anywhere, whether it is this Neo-Palladian home built by Colin Campbell, that was the original structure, or the first thing being built on the property. And then you get to the lake, which is, I want to say 1 or 2 miles in circumference. And you basically just are having this experience where you're seeing these buildings that look like it is the Pantheon in Rome, that looks like it is, well, one of them looks just like the Temple of Apollo at Baalbek in Lebanon. And you have this experience of turning a corner, and then you see out of the corner of your eye a structure in the distance that looks like something made during the ancient Roman Empire. So it is a surreal experience because it's so big, it's so serene, you have no idea where you are or when you are, I think is the most important thing about it. Even today, it being owned and very well preserved by the National Trust, it just completely transports you in time and place to this sort of Arcadia, this fabricated, that's another thread, that's another chapter. This imaginative sort of heaven-like place on earth that is unspoiled or untouched by modern man. But really, I could try to explain it. I mean, it is overwhelming. It is so beautiful. Every building, every part of the lake looks different from various vantage points. My favorite view is up at the Temple of Apollo, because you look down on the whole lake. You see reflections of the buildings in the water. I mean, well, I guess people can Google images, but going is an entirely different experience.
And sorry.
I was just going to say, it was like when I went to Paris for the first time and saw these paintings on a large scale.
Isn't it? What's amazing, as you say, though, and that's what that's what you put across to the listeners, is it's such a straight, this is an unusual experience, I think, an unusual cultural experience. And I think it was intended to be in the 18th century. I don't think it's unique. There are other places that were doing similar things where you're basically presumably your research, your dissertation, you said that the study of Stourhead and its themes helped you to understand the production and consumption of art of other arts and decorative arts in that 18th century period. Am I right in saying that? So it becomes a paradigm. That what's happening in the experience at Stourhead becomes like a paradigm for other 18th century ideas. So I'm thinking, for example, about you said that there's not just the Pantheon in Rome, but there's the Temple of Apollo at Baalbek, which we know that some 18th century lucky grand tourists were able to get into the Eastern Mediterranean and look at ancient buildings there. So and that idea comes into like Robert Adams' architecture. He also got out to places like Split in former Yugoslavia and did drawings and brought. So there was a lot of Eastern Mediterranean, like ancient Greek stuff coming back in, which of course previously there hadn't been because it was all Rome and Italy. But am I right in saying that creates a paradigm, Stourhead, for understanding other aspects of the 18th century world of collecting and production?
So, I mean, of course, there was, massive influence on art, especially 19th century, the sort of, romantic art. But I think more for me, I think understanding Stourhead helps us understand today. That's more what I'm saying. That's not my thesis. That's not anything. I'm just saying that's why I'm providing this context, because understanding that century where so many important things happen, whether it's the development of art history, archaeology, art collecting, the first museum, like there were so many things that defined the art world and the art ecosystem that we now use today. And the only way to understand that, I think, is to unpack that within a place of beauty, more beautiful than any painting, someone said.
And of course, one of the things you didn't speak about, which is a theme at Stourhead, if I remember rightly, because a lot of this is based on the ancient Roman poet Virgil and his epic poem, the Aeneid, where Aeneas, most famously to us, I think that probably the best read book in the contemporary world, for example, recently translated by Seamus Heaney before he died. He did a translation. It's the book Sits of the Aeneid, where Aeneas famously goes down into the underworld. And there are underworld themes, I seem to remember, in Stourhead, where you go down underground and then you come back up again. So there's this notion of death and life, and is there life after death, I think, that comes into the experience.
For sure. I talk a lot about this sort of, I mean, a lot of this has to deal with life and death and this sort of social transgression, because this family was like nouveau riche. They were bankers. They weren't landed gentry by any means. And so the Ovid, the Virgil's the Aeneid, so it's Ovid's Metamorphosis and Virgil's the Aeneid are two poems heavily talked about. And this, exploration of death, the main man, his name's Henry Hoare, he faced a lot of death in his life. And I absolutely think that's a subject worth noting. And this is what a lot of scholars talk about. But my takeaway is it actually has to do more with posterity and building something to be remembered, because we all die. This sort of like, memento mori, more so than it is like, as all these other academics argue, this means this. Of course, I definitely think it was meant to hint at that, but I think if this man, the man who built it, if he wanted us to know what it meant, he would have absolutely let us know what it meant.
That's interesting. So it's playing on a kind of ambiguity. It's not being didactic. It's doing what great art always does, including great art today, in my opinion. It lets the listener, it lets the viewer decide for themselves. You enter a dialogue in with the art, and you can come out and read it in one way or another. It remains slippery, and that's just such an. It's just so interesting to hear that you're thinking, that you're studying something so old and so 18th century. And for a lot of like my young students, I don't know whether it's, they haven't really studied that sort of classical past, and I'm not quite certain they kind of get it. But it's lovely to hear someone like you saying that there's so much richness to be experienced in understanding that, I think, and then applying it to the contemporary world. So moving on to your career, Rachel, you've been art advising since 2017. You've already hinted to us and the listeners that one of the reasons you wanted to become an art advisor is because you felt a greater purpose maybe in working more personally, more individually with people than in a team, in a business where there's bureaucracy. and you can kind of lose control of the individual. Maybe that I don't know whether, but what led you to start in art advisory, and then what do you hope to contribute moving forward from art advisory? Maybe you could say more about the origins of the art advisory.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep this this part quick, but I interned at the Guggenheim, at Christie's. I worked at an art gallery in Los Angeles that no longer exists. I was director by age 22. I was doing a lot of sales, and I ended up the gallery was closing. We were leaving. So me and the woman who worked there just started art advising, and like art advising in air quotes, because it was originally very transactional. It was, oh, you want this Warhol print? We can find this Warhol print. So it was absolutely sourcing and placing. And my academic background had prepared me slightly, but not, I've learned obviously a lot more since beginning my master's, but we then started understanding the contemporary art market and primary market acquisitions and working with collectors intimately. So a lot of my collectors then are similar to my collectors now, where they are very involved in collecting and they just need help, whether it's sourcing, and now it has to do with making their collections the best they can be, more inclusive of various types of artists throughout history in the present day. And I now, in my current advisory practice, again, it sort of fell into my lap. So I wasn't like, one day I'm going to start an art advisory and here's what I'm going to do for the next 15 years. I was 23, 24 years old. So I had no idea really what I was doing. I just knew that this was something I really liked, whether it was selling, finding, and then negotiating. I really love the business side of it. And then now I do a lot of that, of course, for my collectors, but being able to give input as to what their collection should holistically look like is super important to me. So I think, without going back to the 18th century too much, a lot of what I look at, the 18th, early 19th century is this sort of, again, not getting into this too much, but this concept of like collecting what there is to collect. Within antiquity, there's this concept of whiteness. And I think that, in terms of the art history canon, has obviously been tremendously skewed in terms of inclusivity and representation. I'm half Mexican, I'm Jewish, I'm a woman. If I did go to museums, I certainly didn't think that there were people like me on the walls. I certainly never learned about that. So I think that so much of what I do now and what I hope to do going forward is continue to place historically marginalized artists. So I consider this women, people of color, and LGBTQIA artists into more public and private collections. And in doing so, my goal is to make art collecting more inclusive as well, transparent and seamless. Because as I mentioned, I like working alone because I am really about accountability. And I work very hard. I make sure that my collectors get exactly what they need. If I offloaded that to someone else, can I be certain that everyone's getting the exact care that they need? No. So I think that accountability is key in our industry, and it's something that people are really, that our industry is really lacking at the moment.
May I ask, you spoke about traditionally marginalized groups, which kind of can overlap with your own background. May I ask, are you therefore both sourcing work from people from, like artwork from people from those groups, but also sourcing it very often for collectors who are in those groups, or are they just people who sympathize with those groups, or are you kind of hoping to target people that might come from those groups? So you're kind of dealing with marginalized collectors and marginalized artists.
I 100% right now, I work with a small handful of collectors, and those collectors are considered under the umbrella, most of them as people of color, non-white. And I think that my goal, of course, is to have art collecting be as inclusive as possible, have maybe certain demographics of people that weren't, so easily able to collect art, have that be a more seamless transaction, 100%. I also think that, wait, what was I just about to say? Sorry. 100%. And I think that right now what can be done is creating visibility for these artists in the ways in which the small bits of change can happen immediately.
Interesting. And may I ask, I think it's pretty meaningful to me, and I think I know what your answer is as a classicist, but why did you call your art advisory to Romulus?
Now I'm nervous because I feel like you're going to have some notes, which I look forward to. So I read this book.
I think it's a great name, by the way. It's just, obviously it might have different significance to myself than other people.
I'm so excited to hear yours. Okay, so I read this book called Possession by Erin Thompson, I believe is her name.
Okay.
Have you? Oh, you would.
No, I don't know. I'm just making a note of it.
It's fantastic. Oh my gosh, it's fantastic. It traces the collection, of basically works from antiquity, from the origins, which, she really says, for better or for worse, are the Romans collecting Greek artifacts, which we would, consider art, up until modern day, why there are people at auctions that are crazed and need this bit of history.
Yeah.
And then, throughout that time, whether it was like the Pope's collection, the ways in which collecting works from antiquity and this possessive need have shifted over centuries. And then I also took a course at Hunter with Professor Dye. And my takeaway was that Romans were really the first art collectors, for better or for worse. However, we might really define that. I know that, that might not 100% be true, but I think Romulus having discovered Rome, Romans having discovered art collecting, sort of draws this important parallel to the empire ecosystem of the art world today and the ways in which I plan to revolutionize and reinvent it. So I think it has a lot to do with connecting the past to the present, as I talked about a little bit, but yeah. What do you think? I want to hear.
No. I mean, and of course, Romulus, a bit like Cain and Abel's story in the Old Testament. He killed his brother Remus to start Rome, which is something that always fascinates me. And they've also found, archaeology is found on the Palatine Hill in Rome. They have actually found like Iron Age circular foundations for huts, which is exactly apparently carbon dated to exactly the right time when traditionally Rome was founded in 753 BCE, I think it was. Coincidentally, the same date that the Olympic Games further east in Greece started, which is always it's one of those weird coincidences, if you like.
Yeah.
And of course, Romulus is interesting to me because he politically later on, he's used as a reference, almost becomes like a mythological trope for the difference between a democracy and a monarchy. And when the Emperor Augustus became emperor, after a republican system where you have 2 consuls elected annually, as you know, with a deliberative Senate, and then there's civil wars developed because of the problem with having 2 powerful men with armies behind them. They're going to fight one another and disagree. And out of that, of course, comes what most modern scholars see as a constitutional monarchy, the Roman Empire, under Augustus, who that wasn't his real name, but one of the names that the Senate wanted to give him was Romulus. And the histories say that he refused to be called Romulus because it sounded too monarchic, too much like a monarchy, which they did. And of course, they'd expelled the Etruscan monarchy, which had become corrupt. We all know those stories about the Tarquins. They expelled them to create the Roman Republic. So that it was quite interesting. They wanted to call him Romulus because he was starting again, building a new Rome. But he just didn't like the kind of monarchic connotations of that. So it's a really interesting. It's not just the name of a legendary figure; it becomes part of a discourse about democracy and authoritarianism, totalitarianism later.
Well,
probably nothing to do. But anyway, it's a good name for a for the art
I'll have
advisory?
to unpack that a little more on my end. But for me, I wanted, because it is a startup, I wanted it to be something easy to remember. I wanted it to be something that was something that resonated with me, that I could talk about, and hopefully really at the end of the day is draw modern day collectors. A huge part of it is education. So I think
Yeah,
learning about, okay, what we want to call the start of or one of the starts of civilization and art production being that time. So
absolutely. And I think you're right, by the way. I think most people would agree that the Romans were the first kind of art collectors in our modern sense of the word. People like Cicero, who have an art advisor like yourself,
yeah,
based in Athens,
yeah,
and we got his letters where he's writing and saying, "I can't wait till you get these works to put in my villas." I think there certainly was earlier. There's evidence of collecting in the Near East, but
yeah,
it's not collecting on. It's collecting things.
deliberate.
Yeah, and there are collections in treasuries of temples, of course, that can be seen as collecting. But it's a kind of sacred thing there, really. And I think certainly our modern idea of art collecting, it is the Romans who begin that. You're quite right. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
the I noticed in the launch of Romulus, which is literally only is it just happening now, the launch of Romulus as a company?
It'll be in the next few months. We're
Yeah.
going to, so it's undergone a few iterations, but the
Yeah.
first sort of group of beta testers will be sometime in the next month or so. And then after that, a few tweaks, and we're hoping for May.
Good, good, good. And did you prepare a business? Did you write a business plan for?
Oh, yes.
Yes, you've done all that. Oh,
This
yeah,
one,
I'm
yes.
just I'm just finishing off marking of my students' business plans. They have to do a business plan on some,
Oh,
that's it's quite interesting. I noticed that one of your focuses is on art logistics.
yeah.
That's quite interesting. Can you explain what made you decide to focus? It sounds as though it's a particular focus of your art advisor. Is that to differentiate yourself from other art advisors?
Yeah, so Romulus and Racial Art Advisory are different. Racial Art Advisory will use Romulus, as
Okay.
will other art advisors. So Romulus is three parts. There are three central focuses. One of them is this sort of logistics and communication, because I think, people listening to this may not realize if they are art collectors or not. The process of collecting art is very confusing. There's a lot of back and forth. It seems pretty chaotic. You're getting emails, you're sending screenshots, and then that's before the acquisition even happens. After that, it's invoice, payments, shipping, framing, insurance. It's hanging. There's so many things that there aren't a lot of people that, or not a lot of advisors I've seen that hold your hand through the process. I do, I try to, but I think having a way to streamline this for the collector, but also for other art advisors to use that don't have the capabilities to hire a full-time staff or a full-time registrar. Not only that, to have a registrar that is trained, and that is, very important. So for me, I've spent a lot of time handling my own shipping. It has absolutely affected my deal flow, because I can't move on to the next deal, especially with the collector, until that deal is complete, until that work is hanging on their wall or it's shipped, whatever it might be. So that process requires a lot of diligence and upkeep. And honestly, it just is like the worst part of the business that people want to outsource. So that is a very important part of Romulus, because it is solving a problem that absolutely needs fixing, that can be fixed. And I know there's a couple other companies that do it, but me backing this company, people know me, people trust me. I think that's a very important part, to know that I will see your client's painting from start to finish, be seen, in their home. And same with collectors coming through and saying, I just bought this, how do I get it? What's the deal? Having that hand-holding experience.
Absolutely. And a lot of other non-art small businesses, particularly through the pandemic, where everything was, being done from home rather than from the bricks and mortar shop. People who make like high-end cakes and confectionaries. And when I listen to a lot of stuff on the radio, as I'm sure you do, and speaking to these people, and it's so important to all of them, from the very low end to the very high end luxury goods. You know, I received a package the other day from Hermes in Paris, and honestly, if you buy it in Harrods, I would say that the experience of getting this beautiful box and open it, it's come and it's got Rue de Faubourg on the front, so it's quite exotic when it arrives. Opening the box up, and the box is quite plain, but inside it's so beautiful, and it becomes an experience actually opening that up. And there's a lovely little card in an envelope saying, hope you enjoy your perfume or whatever it is. And I know that I know a lot of art logistics companies. I know that Sotheby's, with their high-end clients, they put a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses inside the packing case. So I wonder if you could comment on whether that it's not just the the nuts and bolts parts of packaging this stuff and making sure it arrives unbroken and safe in the house, but the actual logistics becomes part of the deal.
Of course, it's, so much of it is client relations and making people, a huge thing for me is making people feel very good about a deal. Everyone who's involved in a deal needs to walk away not feeling screwed in any capacity. And for a lot of people that are buying expensive works and it's their first artwork, the bottle of champagne helps, of course. I love giving very personalized gifts to my collectors when they make these huge purchases, because it's something so special to them. And I think, though, there are a lot of white glove services out there for shipping and logistics and stuff, but the collectors I'm focusing on, the artworks I'm focusing on, aren't particularly multi-million-dollar artworks necessarily. Those people buying those have experience buying those. They know, that will be taken care of. This is for someone that buys a $10,000 painting and isn't comfortable spending $2,000 on shipping. So
Sure.
they need a few options. They need like a little bit more of a, all right, how do we do this, but not crazy expensive, but so that it's still safe. They want to feel taken care of in that sense.
Yeah, and I'm just looking around my own room here actually, and I'm at the kind of level as an art collector where I buy something, and probably the frame tends to cost at least the same as the work. And I'm looking forward to the day, because it's very, very important how you frame the work. I'm looking forward to the day when the work becomes more expensive than the frame, if that makes sense. But I guess that's a kind of an analogy to what you're saying, that whether you're dealing with high-end works on the secondary market, a Picasso or something, or whether you're dealing with works by ultra contemporary artists for collectors that are very, very interested in these artists for often social reasons. They identify with them, but those kind of works, it can be an issue, can't it? That balance between paying a lot for things like framing and the logistics, the packaging, if you're going to post it, and the actual cost of the work itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, people don't realize if it's a heavy work, if it's a bit, if like there are certain things that it's more about information. What I'm providing really when it comes to logistics is information and giving a helping hand to people, that advisors or gallerists that need it, that don't have the resources to hire. But it's saying, for example, you should probably not ship the work framed. You should probably ship it to your destination and then frame it.
Yes.
And don't do glass, do, UV plexi, just these sorts of things, because, and this sort of goes back to art collectors and the art world and transparency and accountability. Is a lot of my collectors, even before working with me, were definitely taken advantage of. I think that when you're new to an industry that is so unfamiliar to you and unfamiliar to many other industries, you think paying, $2,500 for a frame is fine, but that's not how much the frame costs. So I think having someone say this is okay is going to be a very important part, and get those new collectors in, because the other two parts of Romulus are education and a social component. Mm-hmm. So it is about outreach and getting collectors or prospective art collectors in, because I think, as I mentioned, I didn't see a lot of artists or people in the art world like me. Now, of course, that's a different story slightly, but it was a very male dominated industry, and a very white straight male dominated industry in all sides. So also back to me being an undergrad, I didn't know what options were ahead of me. And I thought that entering the art world, being an advisor, working at Christie's or something, you do need this sort of prestige or pedigree to make it. And it's the same thing as artists feel, as collectors feel. And I work almost entirely with first generation collectors. They did
Right.
not grow up with their parents collecting, and they are creating a collection for themselves and their family. So they do need the understanding that they can be part of this game. The new collectors can be involved, and once they get in and like play the game, not the game in the sense of the market game, but it's not this chaotic like free for all, that there can be some reason and transparency within this industry.
I think that's really commendable. I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and so it's just really interesting that you're working at that what the market would see at the lower end. But I hate that term lower end. You're actually working with the grassroots and creating something together with your collectors and artists, which is really, really worthwhile. And you spoke about those other. We spoke about the logistics, and then you spoke about education. Could you say something about how that might work with Romulus?
Of course. So education, so there's three central, focuses, education being one of them. So that will be in the form of summits. So I'm in Dubai. I'm going to Abu Dhabi for the Forbes 3050 summit, where I will go and learn about how these sorts of day-long conferences are. And then I will use that and apply it to a day-long conference, a crash course on how to be an art collector, how to interact in the art world. And I will have people I work with in the art world have these sort of very transparent and honest conversations with people that have questions, because I think, again, that's a major issue. Other points of education will be a dissemination of news, of artworks, of artists that, I think are really great. And that will be on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, things like this, to teach about art history. And then the other part of it is a social platform, which will be these in-person events, sure, but it's also going to be an online forum, which will create communication and connections between people within the art world. So right now, there isn't really something that exists that allows for artists or collectors to say, hey, this is the scenario I'm dealing with. Am I being taken advantage of? Or, oh, I just bought my first artwork, I'm so excited. Whatever it is, it's an anonymous and vetted forum that allows people within the entire art world ecosystem to communicate, give advice, create this sort of community that allows for honesty and transparency accountability. That's my whole thing. Because if a gallery is not playing by the rules, if I'm not playing by the rules, if no one is safe, and I think that's going to be the biggest part of it, is it's just going to encourage the art world to do better.
And that will be in the form of an app, will it?
Yeah. So the whole thing is an online system. You log in, you have a membership. It's a paid membership, and you're able to communicate, and then you're able to receive, and send out logistical type communications.
So the forum will be an online chat forum where the users can prefer to remain anonymous, they are anonymous. And you'll be kind of checking and vetting in case there's anything abusive or etc. All that stuff.
Of course.
Yeah, and but it's to encourage more transparency. This dealer is this gallery's approached me, and they're offering me a contract where they take 70, I take 30. Is that good? That sort of question.
Exactly. I want everyone to feel like they have a place to go with trusted people, and they're not just posting on Reddit or anything like that. And I remember when I was considering grad school programs, I went on Reddit because I wanted to know if institutions like the IFA or Columbia were worth it, essentially, for me to wait another year and honestly pay 10 times the price, if that was worth it. Or I guess Sotheby's is in there too. And
I was just thinking of the same thing for us and our fees. Yeah. Hopefully it's worth it.
Hunter. And
we do. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I reached out to my network and asked a bunch of people, and I could not have been happier with Hunter's program. I thought it was unbelievable. I'm so grateful I did it. It's changed every part of my life for the better. And I wish I had like an ability to post something and have people give me that feedback. Even when I was an undergrad, said, hey, what are my options for jobs? Because I don't know what they are, and have people give me advice. But none of that existed.
Yeah.
And it's really necessary.
Absolutely. I mean, in my experience of education, I used to go to my son's school careers day, and I had this little desk and it had the art business on it. And people would come up and they say, you know, oh, my daughter really loves, or my son, my daughter really loves art, but what is the art business? And I said, well, what careers do you think there are in the art world if you want to go into that? And they tend to say, oh, you know, maybe if luckily I might end up, I'd like to work in Tate or the National Gallery or the British Museum, and it's all public sector. And the only thing they seem to be told by their careers is possibly auction houses, but they knew nothing about commercial galleries, art advisory, art insurance. They didn't realize there's all these other jobs. And the reason they don't know that is not in the careers books. A lot of people who teach art history don't like anything to do with the market and standard business anyway. So there's a kind of bias against that anyway. And, you know, it kind of opened a lot of people's eyes when I said there's all these other things out there. You know, so the MA Art business that we teach, that actually came about because Sotheby's, that used to be our owners, and I'm not going to go into that now, but we use the brand name and we're connected with them, but we're not owned by them anymore. They said that all the Sotheby's students that are coming to, no, all the people that we employ, they come from the Courtaulds, they come from great art history institutions, but they know nothing about business. Can you create an MA which bridges them into that world? So that's kind of where our program comes from. And I just wanted to say, Rachel, that we you know, we do a lot on art law and ethics. So we have a mission to encourage ethical behavior amongst our students. Whether or not they then go and play in that way, I don't know. But we all understand, like, exactly what you're saying, that it still remains a very untransparent world. And I think your Romulus company sounds as though it's very much on the right track to do something about that, which I and I think all my students and colleagues would strongly agree with. Just as we're coming to the end of the time now, you're in Dubai, you've been to the art fair. Can you give us any feedback on the experience?
Yeah, of course. I attend many art fairs. This one is a smaller, obviously it's a regional art fair, and I'm here for, as I mentioned, a Forbes conference beginning tomorrow in Abu Dhabi, which is the women's under 30 are basically matched and mentored by women on the 50 over 50 list. So this was a must attend for me. I was very excited. And I looked at my calendar and I saw that Art Dubai was the weekend before. And I couldn't have been happier because, you know, I've actually never been to really this part of the world. And the fair itself was excellent. It was contained. There were really three major sections. One of them was digital. It was a beautiful fair. And a lot of artists I saw were complete discoveries to me. I didn't buy anything for collectors, but I also didn't arrive until day 3 of the fair. So it might have been a different story on opening night, but I was really able to just gain a little bit more perspective, meet some gallerists. There were a lot of actually London-based galleries there, and it was great. I mean, it was excellent. I think what I also was surprised about was there was such a focus on digital art, which was something I learned a lot about while being here. And I think that in terms of it being like the cutting edge of art, entertainment, you know, the UAE in general, sort of being very much at the forefront in its own ways when it comes to this, especially with, you know, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, a stone's throw. I'm going to see that tomorrow. I'm very excited. I thought it was great, and it has potential to be a phenomenal fair. I think it's far, so that's going to be difficult to get Americans to come to. And there were no Americans that I saw or interacted with, and that's hopefully will change the next handful of years.
I have to ask this question because some of the listeners will be very interested in this. Obviously, you spoke earlier about marginalized groups in society, LGBTQ plus. It's we know that that someone like Dubai hasn't got a great track record for its tolerance of a lot of these marginal groups. Did you see any of that at the fair? Did you feel there's any kind of censorship of types of art or subject matter or artists or whatever, or didn't you feel that that was visible? It's a difficult question because you're sitting in Dubai, obviously, so you don't necessarily have to answer it.
It is.
You
I
know.
mean, I think, from what I'd heard, about Qatar, I just in general about the Middle East, I think obviously there are some strong misconceptions about what it is, what the liberal sort of mentality here. I haven't, it's hard to explain because I actually don't know that much, but I said I'm here with someone who works in entertainment here, and she says that it's very open and accepting, but I didn't recognize many of the artists. I don't know what their backstories were. I think it played it safe. It wasn't as maybe open as like FIAC is, for example. I remember, there's nudity everywhere, and it's definitely a risque fair comparatively, but it's a conservative fair. And I think that, they play it safe in that sense, but there was nothing that really stood out to me, honestly.
Great. So, Rachel, we're coming to the end now. I just wondered if I have a question here. Any tips for aspiring art advisors? But it might be nicer if you can just speak to people of your own generation or maybe younger, even people coming into that world now, doing undergraduate degrees in art history or MAs, and give them any advice on how to approach this world, which, as I say, is a little bit hidden from career services, as I understand it, across the world.
I think I'm very grateful for my experience, having worked at all of these different institutions and getting a little taste for everything. I highly recommend that. I highly recommend living and working and experiencing different parts of the world. I recommend using the Romulus forum when it's up and running. I'd say for aspiring art advisors, whether they be, undergraduate students, I personally don't necessarily think you need to work for another advisor or be declaring yourself as an advisor and have a certain skill set. I think you need to distinguish yourself as what type of art advisor you might be, or what type of art advisor you want to be. I think that is really important. When I mentioned I work with collectors that are, again, either buying their first artwork or they're, very prolific collectors, but all of them are high net worth individuals that are very much interested in growing a collection, and they, spend quite a bit each year. I think that I am very lucky in that sense. I think that I've done a lot to keep my clients, and whatever you do in the art world, just understand that it is a tricky place to be in any sector of it. And maintaining integrity, accountability, honesty is the only way I survived and was able to get to the successful place I currently am. And it's the only piece of advice, no matter where you are. If you're at a small gallery and they're having you do some weird backdoor deals, or if you're, at an auction house and you're DMing people, poaching them for artwork, I know that happens. It is just about being a good person at the end of the day.
That's lovely to hear, and it reminds me the previous podcast with another young art advisor, Michaela Milikuri. She said exactly the same thing. That
really?
Yeah. And when she lectured to my students, she said, just always choose to do the right thing and always be open and honest, because your reputation depends on that, and you will be tempted sometimes. But if you do that, you can get stuck, if you like.
You can.
The art world is relatively unregulated, because relatively it's quite small financial transactions compared to everything else going on in the world of business. So it's just lovely to hear both of you saying that is a key tip. Just be honest to yourself and be honest and open with your clients.
Absolutely. I think the other thing I was going to say is it is a really small world, and your reputation is everything, like she said. And I've actually never lied to any of my collectors, which a lot of people don't believe. But even if it is something as payment has gone through, little white lies, because I've seen other advisors do it relentlessly and just to get the deal done. And I don't know how they keep track of all these lies, honestly. I certainly couldn't. So I just am like, nope, truth through and through, again, with this accountability thing, where if I mess something up, I am letting them know that, you know, this is not done because of me, or whatever it might be. So don't lie to your collectors.
The buck stops here. The buck stops here with me. And again, that's the nice thing about being, you know, a small team or your own art advisor as opposed to part of an art advisory group. So Rachel, thank you so much for giving up your time today, and I wish you luck with the next event, which is in Abu Dhabi, which is where you're meeting these older women. Am I right in saying, or older men and women that are meant to be mentoring?
Older and younger women. I have a few meetings lined up with potential collectors, so hoping again to spread it to, especially to women collectors. I only have a few women collectors right now. I'm really excited to get some more.
Absolutely, and of course that's something that is growing. I did some recent research, which hasn't actually been published yet. It was launched at Sotheby's last week, but the auction house. But these reports are based on what's going on in the art world and demographically, and there's quite a lot of evidence that there are more women HNWIs who are choosing to collect art. So I think for people of yours and Michaela last week's generation as art advisors, hopefully you're going to have a lot more people that you can perhaps identify with, you know, coming into that world. So let's hope that continues. So thank you very much, Rachel, and maybe we can speak again to see how your company's running in a year's time.
That sounds great. I would love that. Thank you for everything. This was so fun. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rachel.